The hospital waiting room fell silent when she walked in. Not because of her worn-out shoes with soles peeling at the edges, or the faded jacket she clutched around her shoulders despite the warmth inside. It was her eyes that commanded attention. Eyes that had seen too much, carried too much, yet somehow still held a flicker of stubborn dignity that refused to be extinguished. Margaret Chen was 73 years old, and she had come to see the doctor who had treated her late husband 15 years ago, not for medicine or charity, but for something far more precious and increasingly rare in this world. She approached the reception desk with measured steps, each one deliberate and careful, as if she were crossing a bridge made of glass. The young receptionist looked up from her computer screen, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to barely concealed impatience in the span of a heartbeat. Margaret could read faces the way others read books, and this one told her everything she needed to know. Still, she straightened her spine and spoke with a voice that trembled only slightly. She explained that she had an appointment, that she had called 3 times to confirm it, that she had traveled 2 hours on 3 different buses to be here on time. The receptionist's fingers flew across the keyboard, her lips pressed into a thin line of annoyance, before declaring that there was no appointment under that name, that perhaps she had the wrong day, the wrong clinic, the wrong everything. Margaret felt the familiar, burning sensation behind her eyes, the one that came before tears, but she blinked it away with practiced efficiency. She had not cried in public since the day they lowered her husband into the ground, and she would not start now. She simply asked if the receptionist could check again, speaking slowly and clearly, the way she had learned to do when people assumed that her accent meant she couldn't understand or be understood. The receptionist sighed, with theatrical emphasis, the kind of sigh that carries the weight of 1,000 inconveniences, and picked up the phone with obvious reluctance. As she waited, Margaret became aware of the other people in the waiting room watching this scene unfold like spectators at a play they hadn't bought tickets for. If you believe that every person deserves to be treated with dignity and kindness regardless of their appearance or circumstances, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share more stories that matter, stories that remind us of our shared humanity. Now, let's continue with Margaret's story. What Margaret didn't know was that Dr. Michael Santos was standing just beyond the door to the examination rooms, having heard every word of the exchange. He was a man who had built his reputation on skill and knowledge, but somewhere along the way, in the endless parade of patients and paperwork and insurance claims, he had forgotten the lesson his own grandmother had taught him, that how you treat people when they have nothing to offer you reveals everything about who you really are. When he heard Margaret's name spoken with such dismissiveness, something inside him cracked open like an old wound that had never properly healed. He remembered her. He remembered her husband. He remembered the way she had sat by that man's bedside day after day, night after night, holding his hand and telling him stories about their life together, in a voice that never wavered even as his grew weaker. Dr. Santos pushed through the door with enough force to make it swing wide, and the receptionist's expression transformed, instantly from irritation to startled attention. He asked to see the appointment book, and when the receptionist began to explain that she had already checked, he held up one hand in a gesture that was gentle but absolutely firm. He found Margaret's appointment exactly where it was. Supposed to be, scheduled and confirmed, written in the system as clearly as the sun rises in the east. The receptionist's face flushed red with embarrassment or perhaps anger at being corrected, but Dr. Santos had already turned his attention to Margaret, and the smile he gave her was the kind that reaches all the way to the eyes and makes them crinkle at the corners. He greeted her by name, asked about her health, inquired whether she still lived in the same neighborhood near the park with the flowering cherry trees. Margaret felt something inside her chest loosen and expand, like a fist that had been clenched for so long it had forgotten how to open. She followed him to his office, and once the door closed behind them, he asked her what he could do for her today. She explained that she wasn't there as a patient. She was there to ask him something, and she hoped he would hear her out. She told him about the community center in her neighborhood, the one where elderly immigrants gathered every Tuesday and Thursday to share meals, to practice their English, to remind each other that they still mattered in a world that seemed increasingly determined to prove otherwise. The center was facing closure due to funding cuts, Margaret explained, her words gaining strength and clarity as she spoke. They didn't need much, just enough to keep the lights on, to keep the doors open, to keep that small sanctuary alive for people who had nowhere else to go. She wasn't asking for money, she clarified quickly, anticipating his assumption. She knew he was a busy man, an important man, someone whose time was valuable. What she was asking for was even more precious. She wanted him to come speak to the city council on their behalf. She wanted him to tell their stories, to use his voice and his position to advocate for people who had been rendered invisible by age and language and circumstance. She wanted him to see them, really see them, the way he had once seen her husband, not as a problem to be managed or a box to be checked, but as human beings worthy of respect and consideration. Dr. Santos sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, Margaret felt her hope beginning to waver like a candle flame in a strong wind. She prepared herself for the polite refusal, the expression of sympathy followed by the explanation of how busy he was, how many obligations he already had. Instead, he asked her when the council meeting was scheduled. He asked her what time she needed him to be there. He asked her what he could do to help, and the way he asked made it clear that this was not performative kindness or guilt-driven charity, but genuine human connection, the recognition of one person's dignity by another. Margaret's voice broke when she thanked him, and this time she let the tears come because they were not tears of humiliation or defeat, but of relief and gratitude so profound it had to find release. She told him that she had been to 7 other doctors, 3 lawyers, 2 professors, and a dozen community leaders before coming to him. Some had been polite in their refusals, others had been less so. One had offered her money, as if that were the only currency she understood, as if respect and recognition could be purchased like groceries at a store. But Dr. Santos had listened. He had heard not just her words, but the lifetime of experience and wisdom and dignity that stood behind them. The city council meeting took place 3 weeks later in a municipal building where the fluorescent lights hummed with anxious energy and the air smelled of old coffee and bureaucratic exhaustion. Dr. Santos arrived in his work clothes, still wearing his hospital ID badge, having come directly from a 12-hour shift. He was exhausted, running on determination and the memory of his grandmother's face, but when he stood before the council members and began to speak, his voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. He talked about Margaret and the others at the community center. He talked about the contributions they had made to the fabric of the city, the children they had raised, the businesses they had built, the neighborhoods they had shaped with their labor and their dreams. He talked about what it means to build a society that values all its members, not just the young and the productive, and the conventionally successful. The council chambers were more crowded than usual that evening, and in the 3rd row sat Margaret along with 47 other members of her community center, all of them dressed in their best clothes, all of them sitting with straight backs and lifted chins. They had come to bear witness, to add their silent presence to Dr. Santos's eloquent words, to remind the decision-makers that they were real people, with names and histories, and the right to exist in spaces that acknowledged their worth. When the vote came, it was unanimous. The funding would be restored. The center would remain open. The victory was significant. But what mattered more to Margaret was what happened after the meeting ended. Dr. Santos found her in the crowd outside the building, and she took his hand in both of hers, her grip surprisingly strong for someone her age. She thanked him again, but this time her gratitude encompassed something larger than just this one victory. She thanked him for seeing her, for listening to her, for treating her with the respect that should be every person's birthright but too often becomes a privilege dispensed according to invisible hierarchies of value. She told him that he had reminded her why she had loved this country when she first arrived all those decades ago, not for its wealth or its opportunities, though those had been meaningful, but for its promise that every person deserves dignity, that every voice deserves to be heard. If this story has touched your heart in any way, if it has reminded you of someone you know or inspired you to treat others with greater kindness, please show your support by liking this video and sharing it with others who might need to hear this message. Before we reach the end, please take a moment to comment below and tell us, when was a time someone showed you respect when you needed it most? Your stories matter, and we'd love to hear them. Dr. Santos carried that evening with him as he returned to his practice, and something fundamental shifted in the way he moved through his days. He began to notice the small moments of dismissiveness and impatience, the tiny erosions of dignity that happened in hospital hallways and examination rooms, the way certain patients were listened to while others were merely processed. He started speaking up when he witnessed such moments, gently at first and then with increasing firmness, using his position and privilege to create space for those who had none. He taught the younger doctors and nurses that medical knowledge, while essential, was only part of their job. The other part, equally important, was seeing the full humanity of every person who came through their doors. Margaret continued her work at the community center, but she became something else as well, a reminder to everyone she encountered that respect cannot be earned because it should never have to be. It is not a reward for achievement or good behavior or meeting someone's standards. It is the baseline of human interaction, the foundation upon which all other virtues must be built. She lived 7 more years after that city council meeting, 7 years during which she never stopped advocating for her community, never stopped demanding that the world recognize their worth. When she finally passed away, surrounded by family and friends and the people whose lives she had touched, Dr. Santos attended her funeral and spoke about what she had taught him. He told the gathering that Margaret had asked him for something that should have been freely given, something that cost nothing to provide, but means everything to receive. The community center still stands today, and in its entrance hall hangs a photograph of Margaret Chen, smiling with that indomitable dignity that no hardship could diminish. Below it, a plaque reads simply, "She didn't ask for much, just a little respect." Visitors to the center often pause before that photograph, and in those moments of quiet reflection, perhaps they remember their own Margaret, someone who taught them that true strength lies not in demanding special treatment, but in insisting on basic human dignity, not just for themselves, but for everyone. And perhaps, in remembering, they carry forward the lesson she spent her life teaching, that how we treat each other in the smallest moments, in the most ordinary encounters, is the truest measure of who we are and what kind of world we are building together, one interaction at a time, one moment of recognition at a time, one act of respect at a time,